There we go. Don't know what was missed there. Okay. So 1406 BC, Deuteronomy chapter 14, at the end of it. They're in the plains of Moab, Abel Shittim, on the eastern side of the Jordan River. Moses' farewell address around January 1406 BC. Middle Bronze Age 2B. At this moment in time, China is being led by Emperor Y Ren of their Shang dynasty. And Egypt is being led by Pharaoh Mibri Sheshi of Egypt's 14th dynasty, which is a dynasty of foreigners. They are known as the Lesser or Early Hyksos. These foreigners are able to come in and take advantage of Egypt because Egypt is in their second intermediate period. It's at a low point because of the devastation of the Exodus plagues and the loss of the army in the sea. And so mixed in with these Hyksos are some of the Amalekites that fought with Israel in Rephidim in Saudi Arabia. While Israel was on their way out, the Amalekites and others were on their way in because this was worldwide news and event here. And also right at this moment in time, a biblical place known as Babylon, and their old kingdom, is being led by King Ammi-Saduqa. So with the Lord's people, I mentioned the generations here. In the tribe of Judah, we have a young man named Salmon, whom I'm estimating to be 19 years old right now. He is the 29th generation of Adam. He will be father to Boaz, will be second great-grandpa to David. So with these generations, I've been asking this the last couple of weeks, we've got 3 folks left alive from the older generation while the rest have died off. One of them is the one the Lord is speaking through and who wrote the book of Deuteronomy, and his name is Moses. And one of the other 2 is someone who will be taking over from Moses, and he's got the very next book named after him, and his name is Joshua. And now the tough one to remember, we had a church member with his name. He, along with Joshua, was one of the 12 spies who checked out the land and came back, but he and Joshua gave a good report where the other 10 of the 12 gave a bad report, and they got struck down for it. And the other guy, along with Joshua, who gave a good report saying that God can take us and do this, his name was? That's right, Caleb. So Joshua, Caleb, and Moses are the last 3 standing from the older generation. So Deuteronomy 14, let's pick up at the end of the chapter. Brother Clay asked a question about this in our last class, comparing the tithe that's mentioned here with the tithe that's mentioned earlier in the chapter. And again, tithes predated the law of Moses. So tithes are not a law of Moses thing. Abraham tithed to Melchizedek, so tithes were an understood practice before. So phasing out the law of Moses and satisfying that and completing it doesn't phase out tithes because they predated that. So let's pick up in verse 28 and see what we see here. Deuteronomy 14:28, at the end of every 3rd year, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in that year, you shall deposit it in your town, and the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance among you, and the stranger, the orphan, and the widow who are in your town, shall come and eat and be satisfied, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. So, as Brother Clay was observing and questioning, this is separate and distinct from, and for a different purpose, than the other tithe that was mentioned in the beginning of the chapter. Specifically Deuteronomy 14:22, which says it's an every year tithe. This tithe is a special tithe only once every 3 years, and it's for a special purpose. And it's specifically for the Levites who have no lot inheritance like the other tribes, and it's for the stranger, orphan, and the widow to make sure they're taken care of. So every 3 years, contributions are made to this pot to last for and provide for those over the course of the next 3 years until the next collection is made every 3 years. So any thoughts or questions wrapping up chapter 14 on that and its distinction from the regular tithe? All good? Moving on to chapter 15. And again, not reading word for word everything, but some things definitely worth highlighting here. And we'll get some actual commentary on chapter 15 here. Deuteronomy 15, let's go ahead and read the first 6 verses. Deuteronomy 15:1, at the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. And this is the regulation for the release of debts. Every creditor is to forgive what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not require it of his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. From a foreigner you may require it, but your hand shall forgive whatever of yours is with your brother. However, there will be no poor among you, since the Lord will certainly bless you in the land, which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess, if only you listen obediently to the voice of the Lord your God, to follow carefully all this commandment which I'm commanding you today. For the Lord your God will have blessed you just as he has promised you. And you will lend to many nations, but you will not borrow. And you will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. Stop right there. Reactions, thoughts, comments, questions on what we just read in those first 6 verses. Let me put it back to you. What did we just read in those first 6 verses?
Well, I got something this time when we first started talking about the sabbatic, the forgiveness of debt. That's crazy. But it said that, remission of debts and everything. However, there will be no poor among you. So that says nobody owes anybody anything because you don't have to borrow. Is that what that means?
No. There's a difference between being poor and borrowing. You don't have to be poor to borrow. For example, you could be middle class and still have a car loan or a house loan and things like that. So it's not talking about that context, but you do bring up a very interesting point. There will be no poor among you. Well, we're all living that. We see that every day because society is doing things in a godly way and we don't have any poor in society, right? Does that mean that if someone's poor, it's because they're not being godly? That there are no such thing as a godly person who's poor? There's context, obviously. But again, we're talking about this is what it's going to be like. Moses is telling the people of God who voluntarily come and signed up and said they want to be the people of God, where God is calling them to be. So when they get to that land, of course, good to put in practice on their way there, but when they get to their land and they're setting up shop and they have their homes and their societies and all this stuff in their cities, this is how they are to be living and conducting themselves. And God says through Moses, there will be no poor among you, verse 5, if. That biggest word in the Bible, 2 letters, if. And it's in the context here. So we're not talking worldwide. We're not talking about society as a whole. Though the principles do work if society were to apply them. If only you listen obedient to God, follow carefully all this commandment. Commandment isn't optional, but that's the definition of commandment. And so do what God says, and this will be the situation. So there's that. Let's talk about this here. Just right at the beginning, this concept, as Brother Clay said, so at the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. And this is the regulation for the release of debts. Every creditor is to forgive what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not require it of his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. To which Brother Clay says, well, that's crazy. Yes, you're right. It is. But that's the deal. So how does this work, and why does this work, and what's the whole thing here? We have a little more commentary here from Jonathan Cahn in his book, The Harbinger, on this very thing, on this Sabbath year, this Shemitah. He says this, and this is also in his book, The Mystery of the Shemitah, on this very passage. This letting go aspect, interesting I didn't plan it this way, but in the devotional we were talking about letting go. This letting go aspect of the Shemitah will touch the economic realm and transform it. So in the 7th year, all debts are canceled, to which I added a note here. I guess no 30-year mortgages, Sister Carolyn, but everyone who has made a loan has to annul it. Those in debt are released. Anything still owed is forgiven. All credit is nullified. All debt is wiped away. All this takes place at the very end of one specific day, the 29th day of the Hebrew month of Elul, the last day of the civil year, the very end of the 7th year. Let me pause right there. just to make these more confusing, the Jewish Hebrews have 2 calendars. The same months, but 2 cycles. One starts on what's called the first month, which is Abib, also known as Nisan. It's the 14th of that month that Passover happens. And so there's that year cycle. They're called Nisan years. And then the 7th month is Tishri. And from Tishri to Elul, the month before the next Tishri, that's another 12-month cycle. And so where Nisan years are considered the spiritual calendar, especially with Passover and the spiritual festivals and all that, and the feasts and all that, the Tishri one is more of a kind of a civil calendar. It's referred to as. But it's funny because it's still referred to as and Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, is in the 7th month. And it's still called the 7th month. So Happy New Year on the first day of the 7th month. And Feast of Trumpets, Yom Kippur is the 10th day, and all that stuff. So just to add to more confusion for us, but that's how it is. So the Sabbath year runs from Tishri to Elul, from the 7th month to the 6th month, and the last day of the 6th month is the 29th. They alternate between 29 and 30-day months because they're on a lunar calendar. And where we have a leap year where we add 1 day to February, they have leap months where every so many years they add a whole month in to fall into the cycle. And every 19 years the lunar and the solar cycles line up, and it's called the Metonic cycle for the guy from Greece who figured all that out. So, ready for the test? Yeah. So anyway, Sabbath year, Tishri to Elul, it ends on Elul the 29th. And as Jonathan Kahn is sharing from the Harbinger and the Mystery of the Shemitah, all this takes place the very end of one specific day, 29th day of the Hebrew month of Elul, last day of the civil year, very end of the 7th year. So the 29th of Elul is the climax, the focal point, the finale of the Shemitah, the Sabbath year. It is the day when the nation's financial accounts are to be nullified. In the Hebrew reckoning of time, adding another factor to the mix, in the Hebrew reckoning of time, each day begins not with the morning, but with the night. This goes back to Genesis 1, when the account of creation records that there was first darkness, night, and then the day. So every Hebrew day begins with the night before the day. Since night begins with sunset, every Hebrew day begins at sunset. Therefore, the moment that all debts have to be reckoned as wiped away is the sunset of Elul 29. So that's that. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, we've seen that while the law of Moses has been satisfied and set aside, these principles still apply, and nations that commit themselves to God, even though they don't have to be theocracies, nations that commit themselves to God's ways will get the blessings of following God's ways and get the consequences of not following God's ways because they, like Israel, put themselves in that voluntary position. That happened with America, is a point Jonathan Kahn makes. The stock market crash after 9/11, as the nation had been departing from God, which 9/11 was on the Twin Towers were still on the church grounds of the church, St. Paul's Chapel, where President George Washington and Congress dedicated the nation to God. So it brought us right back to that beginning. And so after 9/11, the following Monday with the stock market opening was the big crash. And that was on Elul 29. That was in a Sabbath year and was on that very day, that last day of the cycle. The housing crisis of 2008 that we all survived and went through. What was the tipping point day of that? It was, and that was another Sabbath year, and that was Elul 29. The exact same day. So the two big crashes, 2001, 2008, were exactly 7 years apart to the day, and it was the day at the end of the Sabbath year mentioned right here in Deuteronomy 15. So any reactions or thoughts, observations, questions on that aspect that we lived through? All good? Yeah. So, and just to show that God's word is alive and kicking. And it is well. And the good news is, even someone who's not a church member, Any Joe Blow walking down the street can see a Bible, pick it up, flip to a verse, look at it, read it, say, oh, cool, I'm going to apply that. Go apply that verse and be blessed for that. God's word does not return void. Now, that is not the fullness of God's word. I will equate it to the difference between dating and marriage. Dating is nice, marriage is so much better. And so too with the Lord. Taking a verse here or there and trying to be a good person, whatever, that's dating the Lord. Being a committed member of the Lord's church, where he has called us to be his assembly and to serve him and love him and honor him and live according to him, that's the marriage relationship. That's where the very same verses take on such a deeper meaning and a greater fullness that can never be appreciated or experienced outside of that. And that includes the principles here in Deuteronomy 15. But let's take a look a little further here. So verse 3, so after this whole thing about releasing the debts at the end of the 7th year, verse 3, from a foreigner you may require it, but your hand shall forgive whatever of yours is with your brother. So this applies to all of you who've made this commitment together, who are brothers and sisters under God in this congregation of the nation of Israel together. This standard doesn't apply to the foreigners. Now keep in mind, as we just read in Leviticus 24, you shall have the same standard for the native and the sojourner, the alien, the foreigner who is with you. So is that a contradiction? No. There were foreigners who joined up with the Jewish Hebrew nation of Israel, who converts from the outsiders. They're not Jewish by birth, but they are to be received in nonetheless and treated as equals. Then there are foreigners who are outsiders, who are hanging around, who are nearby, who they're interacting with. That's on a different level and different relationship than those who have come, and just like God told Abraham, the foreigner among you can be circumcised and become part of you and be with you. So those who haven't made that step, who haven't become one with the Lord's people, those this doesn't apply to them. So verse 4, as Brother Clay mentioned, let's talk about this a little more. However, there will be no poor among you, since the Lord will certainly bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance to possess. Would be nice if verse 4 had a period instead of a comma. But there's a comma followed by that word if. So what's the if? If only you listen obediently to the voice of the Lord your God, to follow carefully all this commandment which I'm commanding you today. So if you do this, if you do verse 5, verse 4 will be the result. So amongst the Lord's people who are wanting verse 4, if we're all doing verse 5, then we will be like verse 4 and not be in that poor circumstance. But again, ask the question, does that mean that the Lord's people are never poor? No. It means that when we are, there's something to be done about it. And that's what we're talking about. Now, again, are the Lord's people poor because they are, and I guess we have to address the word poor too, and what are we talking about poor? The poverty level that gets established, being under that baseline. Well, those who are under the poverty baseline today are living greater than kings did in just a couple hundred years ago. So there's poor people have TVs and cell phones and all that stuff. So it's a matter of what we're talking about here. But we're talking about people who are financially struggling to pay their bills and are not being stupid with their money. So yeah, that can be a struggle. But as we seek the Lord, as we are a family together, we look out for each other, we take care of each other, we help each other in those times of need, so that that's not being poor is not to be a way of life in the Lord's people, because he does provide, he does care for us. And so it's a matter of where our focus is and how we're doing with each other and helping each other out and being here for each other in those times. Verse 6, for the Lord your God will have blessed you, just as he has promised you. You will lend to many nations, but you will not borrow. You will rule over many nations, but they will not rule over you. So, America. Yeah. Little thing called national debt. Yeah. Borrowing from China. Yeah. So the sign of a healthy nation is one where it is lending money to other nations, but not needing to borrow money from other nations. That's a sign of health, spiritually and otherwise. as I'm reading Reagan's diaries and autobiographies and whatnot, he recognized that national security depends on a strong economy. If you don't have a strong economy, then you can't afford your national security. And so part of being strong is being financially strong. And part of being financially strong is doing things according to biblical standards. And so when we operate our finances according to biblical standards, then we are in a financially stronger position and everything else falls in place. But it's absolutely a national security issue. So God says here, again, you will lend to many nations, you will not borrow. You will rule over many nations, they will not rule over you. So if that's not happening, something's wrong. Somewhere eyes got taken off the Lord, and the remedy is to get eyes back on the Lord and do things biblically, responsibly, compassionately, and scripturally, and things will rectify and play out. Easier said than done, maybe, but this is something that if it's actually put into practice, the benefits are there. Tying this in with chapter 14 and the concept of tithing, which I don't spend a lot of time preaching and teaching on. I just address it as we go through scriptures and it comes up and there it is. There's passages in Malachi that talk about do not rob the Lord of the tithes, and in fact see if this doesn't happen, where as you tithe, the Lord opens up the storehouses and you get blessed. To the point where my family's adopted the saying, and we mean this with all our heart, it's not just a cliche, we know, because we've been through tough times, we cannot afford not to tithe. Because it's been said in other ways and phrases, basically, that the Lord gets his money one way or the other. If we don't do it through our tithe, then other things aren't going to work out, and we didn't really save ourselves that 10% because we've exposed ourselves to other things in life that happen. There's a time later on in the history of the Lord's people, during the restoration, after they were released from Babylon and went to rebuild, and they were more concerned, and this is the time of Haggai and Zechariah prophesying, and they basically said, especially Haggai, talks about you're neglecting the Lord's house while you're building up your fancy houses. Have you noticed that your purses have holes in them? The money just seems to be falling out. And there's a proverb that talks about how wealth sure seems to take wings like eagles and just kind of fly away. If you get godly priorities straight, your finances will be straight. And so that's just kind of the idea there. So any thoughts or questions on that? So now, later on in chapter 15 here, the question comes up, so this is a 7-year cycle. So we just had the 7th year, so we're starting fresh, year 1. Okay, so then we're counting down, then there's year 2, year 3. Well, someone wants to borrow something from me and borrow some money from me in year 2. Okay, 5 years, good chance they'll pay it back. Someone wants to borrow from me in year 6. I might not be as inclined to lend in year 6 as I am in year 2, right?
Nancy Pelosi.
Insider trading, yeah. So what does the Lord say about that? Verse 7, if there's a poor person among you, one of your brothers, in one of your towns, in your land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor close your hand from your poor brother, shall fully open your hand to him, generously lend him for his need and whatever he lacks. Verse 9, check this out. Be careful that there is no mean-spirited thought in your heart, such as the 7th year, the release of debts is near, and your eye is malicious toward your poor brother, and you give him nothing. Then he may cry out to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin in you. Now we're getting serious. Verse 10, you shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give to him. Because for this thing, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. Verse 11, notice this. For the poor will not cease to exist in the land. Therefore I'm commanding you, saying, shall fully open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in your land. So verse 4 said, there will be no poor among you. Verse 11 says, the poor will not cease to exist in the land. Which is it? Aren't those verses contradictory? One says, there'll be no poor in the land, and the other says, You'll always have the poor in your land. Those sound pretty contradictory. Is God in the Bible contradicting himself right here in the very same chapter? How do we reconcile this? Well, first off, in verse 15, notice verse 3 says, from a foreigner you may require this. But then verse 4 says, there will be no poor among you. So the context is there may be poor amongst the foreigners among you, but there's not supposed to be among you. But that's again bringing us to verse 5, if you do this. So if there's been a failure to do this, then someone's gotten themselves in a situation, still have compassion on them even if they've gotten themselves in a situation. He says, do not withhold this from your brother or your sister here. And so I'm commanding you shall fully open your hand to your brother, your needy, and your poor in your land. Ideally, it won't happen if everyone's doing what they're supposed to do, but things happen and people aren't always faithful and consistent, and so there are going to be times when there's a need to help someone get back on their feet again. And that's when you are to be compassionate and don't be looking to get your money back, especially if it's year 6 and a need comes up. Do the right thing. God's got you covered. Don't worry about it. Don't begrudge someone and don't be selfish and greedy when the Lord's faithfully provided and providing for us. So does that help with that context in reconciling that discrepancy there? What's that seeming discrepancy there? Good. What else we got? Well, now we go on and talk about servants. Verse 12, if your fellow countryman, Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you for 6 years. In the 7th year shall set him free. So basically an indentured servitude of 7 years. Lots of folks came to America pledging their lives of service for so many years to cover the fee for transport from the old world to the new world. And after the time frame was up, they are free. So an indentured servitude here for a certain time frame. And they're still to be treated okay. Let's see, again, verse 12. If your fellow countryman, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year you shall set him free. When you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. You shall give generously to him from your flock, your threshing floor, and from your wine vat. You shall give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you. And you are to remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I'm commanding this of you today. So very much God doesn't take kindly we who have been brought out from slavery, them from Egypt, us from bondage to sin, who then hold things over other people. Matthew 18, there's a great parable that Jesus gives about that. One who's been forgiven a lot doesn't forgive someone else who owes him a little, and so he's brought back in to account for that, and it's not a pretty sight. And so we have to remember what we've been freed of and freed from, and therefore not hold things against other people or deny other people as the Lord has not denied us. And then it goes on for instructions. Hey, if they want to stay with you, great, et cetera, different conditions for that. Verse 20, you and your household shall eat it every year before the Lord in the place where the Lord your God chooses. So there's that again, the sacrifices and the place there. So those are highlights from chapter 15. Any thoughts, reactions from Deuteronomy 15? Well, guess where that brings us? Deuteronomy 16. I know the suspense was killing you. So, not going through the whole chapter, but some important stuff here. Let's look at the first few verses. Deuteronomy 16, verse 1. Observe the month of Abib, which as I mentioned is the first month, also known as Nisan. Observe the month of Abib, celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God, for in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. You shall sacrifice the Passover to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd in the place where the Lord chooses to establish his name. There's that phrase again. You shall not eat leavened bread with it. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it, the bread of affliction, for you came out of the land of Egypt in a hurry, so that you'll remember the day when you came out of the land of Egypt all the days of your life. We pause there on verse 3. So, Passover, and then 7 days. So there's the day of Passover, then the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days afterwards, which the words are used interchangeably. The Feast of Passover being considered like the first day of that total 8 days. Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Passover, those words get interchanged, but it's referring to that same time frame, starting with Passover on the 14th, then the 15th through the whatever for that week, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But notice specifically in verse 3, at the end it says, unleavened for you came out of the land of Egypt in a hurry, so that you'll remember the day when you came out. So the reason for unleavened bread is given right here, and it's also given back in Exodus. Because they ate it with their boots strapped, their loins girded, and their backpacks on, they ate it ready to march, ready to go, because the Lord was moving and delivering them in a hurry. In other words, leaven is yeast. They did not have time to sit and wait for the yeast to rise or for the dough to prove. And so this was an urgency thing. This was the movement of God thing in a big way thing. And so the whole purpose of bread being unleavened for this is to remember that. Now, why am I saying that? Number one, because it's true and it's biblical. Also because, unfortunately, just like what happened with the law of Moses, what Jesus had to correct, that men had taken and run with it in ways God never intended. You've heard it said, but I say to you, here's what was the actual intent all along. People have taken this too far to say that leaven is sin. What verse is that? That's nowhere in the Bible. There are sacrifices that use leaven in them. So that doesn't work. Jesus even compared the kingdom of God to leaven. He said, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God is like leaven, which is put in the dough and then it spreads quickly throughout. So that's a good thing. But Jesus also said, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which is hypocrisy. So what's the difference here? Leaven, in its imagery, can be good or bad based on the context here. What's the common denominator? Leaven influences the loaf. So there can be good influence, there can be bad influence. The particular leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees that Jesus warned about was the leaven of hypocrisy. He wasn't saying leaven was bad. He was saying their influence is a hypocritical one. So beware of their hypocrisy and the influence of their hypocrisy. That's bad leaven. But good leaven is the kingdom of God influence. He said that that's a good thing. So leaven is not bad. Remember, they had to get leaven out of their houses when this time of year came around, which meant it was okay that it was in their houses to begin with. If they were never to have it at all, what need is there to remove something that's not there? It was okay that it was there the rest of the year. It was just for this time frame to be set aside, because this was a big reminder of the urgency and the grandness of God moving amongst them and moving them out and delivering them. It was a big deal. It was urgency, so no time to sit and wait for it to rise. Does that make sense? Another thought is, too, when it comes to the elements of the Lord's Supper, Christ our Passover is sacrificed, that it's unleavened bread and unfermented wine because fermentation, yeast, is sin. No, not at all. In fact, there are some people who try to divorce or separate the Lord's Supper from the Passover. And it's funny because the very same people who try to separate the Lord's Supper from the Passover are the very same people who say that the elements of the Lord's Supper have to be unleavened. Well, all the unleavened requirements are with the Passover. There's not one verse in the New Testament that talks about the Lord's Supper and requirements of being unleavened. That's not anywhere in there. Paul does say, let's not take the sacrifice with the old leaven of malice, but with the unleavened bread of truth, sincerity and truth and whatnot. But nowhere in the New Testament instructions for the Lord's Supper is there any requirement for it to be unleavened. The only reason for that would be keeping it consistent with the Passover, which was Christ was doing. Remember, the Passover looked forward to Jesus from day one. It was all about Jesus from day one, the Messiah. So this whole coming out in a hurry thing, God moving, it's not about sin. We don't have elements of the Lord's Supper that are without leaven and fermentation because those are sin. No, that's wrong thinking that's not biblical scriptural thinking. We do it because of the urgency of the Lord moving as he did with that first Passover. So profoundly and urgently he moved in our lives, and we are dressed in readiness with him. That's why we don't have yeast or leaven in that, as we remember his moving mightily in our lives and quickly. So kind of important stuff there. Not only know what we do, but why we do it, according to the Bible. So we can skip on down to verse 5. We'll go read 4. Let's read 3 again, just to bring us in context. You shall not eat leavened bread with it. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread with it, the bread of affliction, for you came out of the land of Egypt in a hurry. So that you will remember the day when you came out of the land of Egypt all the days of your life. Verse 4. For 7 days no leaven shall be seen with you in your entire territory, and none of the meat which you sacrifice on the evening of the first day shall be left overnight until the morning. Now, verse 5. You are not allowed to sacrifice the Passover in any of your towns which the Lord your God is giving you, but only at the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish his name. You shall sacrifice the Passover in the evening at sunset at the time you came out of Egypt. Pause right there. So, anything that's done in the homes, with the household, the family, that is not this. This is something that's only done where the Lord causes his name to dwell, which for us is right here amongst our assembly. So this means that this Passover recognition, this Lord's Supper celebration, is something only done in a church congregation capacity, and it's only done where the Lord has authorized his church to be gathered and assembled. That is anything less of that is not what this is. Does that make sense? Pretty clear? Verse 7, you shall cook and eat it in the place where the Lord your God chooses. And in the morning you are to return to your tents. And on from there. Then on to talk about the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, verse 10, skipping down. You shall celebrate the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God with a voluntary offering of your hand, proportional amount, which you give as the Lord your God blesses you. Skip down to these are long verses, yeah. Let's go ahead and read 10 to 11. Verse 10, shall celebrate the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God with a voluntary offering of your hand in a proportional amount, which you shall give just as the Lord your God blesses you. And, verse 11, you shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you, your son, and your daughter, and your male and female slaves, and the Levite who is in your town, and the stranger and the orphan, and the widow who are in your midst, at the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish his name. And so there's that again. All of you, I don't care who you are, mother, father, sister, brother, servant, slave, everyone, come on and celebrate this, but celebrate this here. Come here to celebrate this. It is a very unique thing. We would say the same thing in verse 13 about the Feast of Booths. Celebrate the Feast of Booths for 7 days when you've gathered in from your threshing floor and your wine vat. And then rejoice in verse 15. For 7 days you shall celebrate that feast to the Lord your God in the place where the Lord your God chooses. Because the Lord your God will bless you in all your produce and the works of your hands. So you'll be altogether joyful. So verse 16 sums it up. 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place which he chooses. At the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, which is Pentecost, and the Feast of Booths, which is Tabernacles. They are not to appear before the Lord empty-handed. And so on from there. So 3 times a year at these 3 festivals, they're to come to the place where the Lord caused his name to dwell, and it's to be a time of joy. Remember, this giving to the Lord at these feasts and festivals is a thank you to God. This is a rejoicing. This is a recognition of his deliverance and his blessings, and it is a celebration. It is a very joyful thing. It's not a burden. It's not a drudgery. Again, as I said last week, the Sabbath, for example, was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. We were not made to be subservient or under the burden and weight of it. It was made for us to be a good thing for us, a blessing to us. And in fact, the Sabbath was made to be like the analogy that Joel Richardson makes, is that it's the wedding ring. The Sabbath is a sign of the covenant. Our coming together is our remembrance of what we have with the Lord. And he is our faithful husband to the church bride and the congregation and what we have together. So it's a beautiful thing. All good so far with 16. Let's go to verse 18. You shall appoint for yourself judges and officers in all your towns, which the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes. They shall judge the people with righteous judgment. Verse 19. You shall not distort justice. You shall not show partiality. And you shall not accept a bribe, because a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and distorts the words of the righteous. Justice and only justice you shall pursue, so that you may live and possess the land which the Lord your God is giving you. So, that paragraph might sound obvious to us, might sound only right to us, but still it's very, very important. Because while we know truth in reality is black and white, and right and wrong pretty much are black and white, but human nature can be moved or affected or swayed or caused to second guess or to be biased or kind of favor one side or the other. Different relationships, different influences, all these other factors can come into the mix. So while this might be obvious wording here, it's still a very, very important word. That when it comes down to it, when it comes down to decision making, when it comes down to handing down a ruling, if you will, and the authority that's been given, it is so important that it be done spiritually minded, that it be done clear-sighted, and taking the time to make sure any resolution is reached, obviously first and foremost seeking God and prayerfully under God and listening for his discernment, but hand in hand with that, that there is no influence tainting or affecting the outcome or the decision being made. And that's pretty much the standard for all decisions. Some are more serious decisions than others, but same standard across the board. Any reactions or thoughts on judgments and decision making and the standard and all that? Pretty straightforward? Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and call it good for today, having looked at the rest of chapter 14 and then 15 and 16. So we will pick up in 17 next time around. So feel free to take a look ahead there. If nothing else from anyone else, we will wrap up our Sunday school class for this morning and go ahead and stop our recording, and let's get ready to go before the Lord in song and worship and praise to him before the message.